Okay, so we are going to be a tad bit dangerous. Well, not really dangerous. We're going to experiment a little bit. And the reason why is because of the fact that kind of patrolling around and poking around and looking on YouTube, I have never seen anybody make a chronological series of X-Men videos. And the reason why is because it's just so hard to do. It's kind of funny because I had been tagged in a tweet from Ego Raptor over at Game Grumps who wanted to know what to read after reading House of M with the X-Men. And that's what really confuses people. People read Marvel Comics and they're just kind of like, okay, like House of M was designed to consolidate the mutants, but then where do you go from there? And it's kind of a funny scenario because to talk about this for a second before we get into this origin of Darwin, the way that Marvel did things kind of was really more of like a gradual change, right? Like Quesada took over in 2000 and said, okay, let's reshape, let's rework the landscape, all that kind of good stuff. And so we said, we have thousands of mutants, we need to reduce the number down so that we can focus on stories that emphasize the core mutant base and write more character-driven stuff. And so House of M was designed for the purpose of reducing the mutant population from thousands, if not millions, all the way down to like 198. And then from there, Marvel took the step of going through and saying, okay, let's start focusing on character-driven things. And so between the story House of M and the story Second Coming, it was all just basically story arcs. It was things like Messiah Complex, Messiah War, X-Men Deadly Genesis, Manifest Destiny, Endangered Species, different things like that. I'm stating all those stories out of order. They didn't actually go in that chronological order, but the fact remains it was all just story-driven stuff. After Second Coming, then Marvel said, okay, now you can pretty much read whatever you want to. And from there, it really just kind of breaks down into like Uncanny X-Men and really all new X-Men is really all there is to it. But there were all kinds of stories and events that took place. And so an idea that I've been kicking around, and I'm kind of curious to see how people would respond to it, is basically doing the same thing we did with the Incredible Hulk and just doing like a chronological series of videos on the X-Men and just covering everything that happened with the X-Men roster, whether it's, you know, Cable, X-Force, X-Factor, all that kind of stuff, covering everything that happened with the entire X-Men universe between House of M all the way up to all new, all different Marvel. I'm kind of toying with that idea, and I think it'd be kind of cool to do. But with regards to the character of Darwin, this comes out of X-Men Deadly Genesis. Now, X-Men Deadly Genesis was the first major storyline to be published by Marvel after the events of House of M. And what this story does, or at least what the actual Deadly Genesis story does, is that basically sees the return of Charles Xavier after the events of House of M and Decimation, as well as the introduction of Vulcan, the third Summer's brother. Essentially just this crazy, powerful, you know, like beyond Omega level mutant that can basically just manipulate any form of energy. It's absolutely bonkers, the kind of stuff that he can do. But the fact remains here that with Darwin, this guy's name is Armando Munoz, I think is how you pronounce it. We'll just call him Armando. But the fact remains that he really kind of has like a tragic story. And that's really one of the things that comes across a lot of the mutants that we end up seeing in Marvel is a lot of them come from tragic backgrounds in some form or fashion. It makes for very compelling stories. Sometimes we can identify with those, or at the very least, we can identify with the struggle they endure in trying to just make it day by day. But it's still a pretty cool set of events. And the reason why is because of the fact that he is struggling with a mom that hates him because her husband left them. Now, this is par for the course with mutants, right? Like that's 9 times out of 10, that's the case. Like parents give birth to a mutant and they're just like, oh my God, a mutant, you know, and then they just kind of freak out. The difference here is that some mutants are born with physical appearances, physical displays of their mutation, while others are not. And it's really kind of this crazy scenario because it's almost like you can look at Marvel Comics, you can read X-Men stories, and you could see where groups like the Morlocks, for example, mutants who have a physical mutation, you know, whether it's because they look different or because they're made of paper or whatever the case may be, their mutation is one that people can physically see and they shy away from the public eye. But they look at people like Jean Grey. You would never know that Jean Grey is a mutant, but she's one of the most powerful telepaths and telekinetics in all of Marvel Comics. The same thing with Emma Frost. Unless she turns to Diamond, you would never know that she's a mutant. Charles Xavier, the whole 9 yards. Telepaths usually have it easier. Energy projectors, like Cyclops, he walks around with ruby quartz glasses, and then he just looks like a guy who's wearing a weird set of sunglasses, and that's it. Nobody ever really has a reason to bat an eye. Because of that, their mutations are not obvious. They actually have to show you what it is that they can do. With Darwin, his mutation wasn't as obvious, but something was a little off. His arms were a little bit longer. His eyes were a little bit larger than other children of his same age. And so because of that, whether it's because his father knew what was going on or because his father had basically hypothesized or assumed what was going on, the result was that he effectively abandoned their family. He basically just kind of walked out. And the result is that he was left with with a verbally abusive mother. Now, following this, Darwin's intelligence had basically just kind of manifested to the point that he was insanely smart, one of the smartest kids in the country. Now, in truth, writer Ed Brubaker is kind of toying with this, and we'll talk about why here in a second, but he's toying with the possibility of why it is that Darwin is as smart as he is. But regardless of the reason, the fact remains that his intelligence eventually leads him to gaining the attention of various schools, all of which are vying for the opportunity to have him enrolled and become a part of what it is they have going on. And so the result is that he's inducted in Biltmore Academy. Now, the problem with this is that in Biltmore Academy, the Advanced Education Center, he is basically isolated from his family. His mom really doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And the idea of him being that smart means that she could basically just kind of pass him off on somebody else and say, now he's your responsibility, and she can just go and do whatever she wants to do, be alone, whatever the case may be. But the other half of this is that Ed Brubaker is really good when it comes to fleshing out characters. He's really good when it comes to talking about characters, explaining what characters are about, what their motivations are, why they see the world the way they do. When it comes to the X-Men, as far as the comic book goes, this is especially prominent with Wolverine and the X-Men more so than any other title because it deals so exclusively with what goes on in the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning. The X-Men comics are half personal life and half superhero life. And that was a trend that was established by Chris Claremont, right? Like, that's why the Chris Claremont run of X-Men is just so huge and so lauded, and people say, oh, it's one of the greatest runs of all time, because he emphasized the individual characters and their own personal lives. And so you would open up an X-Men comic by Chris Claremont, and you would be just as likely to see Storm teaching Kitty Pryde about, like, about dresses and how to walk like a woman and sit like a woman and conduct herself like a woman as you would the two of them fighting against Magneto. And so because of that whole interpersonal relationship, because of that whole focusing on the characters, it became a core part of the X-Men series. Going forward, you would end up seeing stories like Young X-Men, different things like that. Even with, Avengers Academy and so on, you would see students dealing with their own individual lives, as well as what it was like being inside of a school. And as we know, inside schools, it sucks. Like, schools are like prisons, right? You got to go in there, you got to beat up the biggest guy to make sure that everybody knows they can't mess with you. Not to mention that once you walk in the school, you can't leave. For 8 hours out of the day, you are in Florence, Colorado's maximum security prison. So because of that, it is it's a crazy situation. But the fact remains here that because of his intelligence, because of his physical appearance, Darwin is basically just a target of abuse and ridicule. That's really all it is. The kids at school give him a hard time, one, because of his intelligence, and it really kind of makes them feel dumb, but the other half is just because he looks different. And so because he's constantly being taunted, his mutant powers manifest for the very first time when one of the kids tries to drown him in a toilet. Now, of course, with Darwin, his power basically allows him to breathe underwater, and the result is that he begins lashing out, and his physical body begins to change to the situation that he's in the sense that his hands turn into rock, and he just starts beating the absolute hell out of these guys. Now, following this, he ends up returning home for a little bit of time off, and when he does, he ends up coming home to, I guess at some point during the night, his mom was smoking a cigarette, it fell under the couch and lit the house on fire, and Darwin rescued her without sustaining any damage to himself whatsoever. And so what ends up happening is we end up finding out that with Darwin himself, his mutant power is that his body is in a constant state of flux. Now, this is the difference between mutant powers in Marvel Comics. When it comes to mutant powers, and even just powers in general, you have what are called active powers and you have passive powers. So with someone like Wolverine, he's got a passive ability. His body will heal from damage no matter what happens. He can't control his body's healing factor. He could be walking down the street, somebody will shoot him in the back, and he'll just keep on walking and it'll heal automatically. He can't control that. On the other hand, someone like Magneto has the ability to manipulate the electromagnetic spectrum, but it's not passive, it's active. His body just doesn't automatically control magnetism. Otherwise, everywhere he went, he would just basically be like a giant magnet. Instead, he has to actively control it on his own. With Darwin, the way his powers function, they function according to any given situation that he's in, as well as his own emotions. And so because of this, when these various scientists begin conducting experiments on him, they put him in a room that's completely black. His eyes develop to the point where he can see in the dark. When they put him in a room and fill it with poisonous gas, his lungs filter the gas as if it were air. His body always adapts to whatever situation he's in. And that is why he's basically a beyond Omega level mutant, because it would seem that there's no clear defined way to kill Darwin. There's no way to actually end his life. If you shoot him, his body will heal. If you set him on fire, his body will counter. His body will always adapt to whatever situation that it's in. And so ultimately, following this research that's done on Darwin, a paper is published. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is this origin of Darwin goes all the way back to like the 1950s or 1960s. So this is in the very early days, almost immediately after the original X-Men team was formed. And so because of this, mutants are really still a pretty new phenomena in the realm of Marvel Comics, in the realm of the superhero community. They're a pretty new introduction. I mean, not a lot of people know about them. Mutants have been around for, you know, thousands and thousands of years, but they're just now coming into the public eye. And so Darwin is a very intriguing character. He's a very intriguing thing to them because at this point in time in the history of Marvel Comics, scientists are just now learning about mutants. And so when they're learning that mutants with telepathy and telekinesis and so on exist, they suddenly stumble across this guy whose body can adapt to virtually anything. And so following the publishing of this paper, Darwin's mom basically makes it adamant that she hates him because of the fact that he's a mutant. And this is to be expected. It's a core part of mutant comics. I mean, it's a core part of the X-Men comics. It's been this way really since Chris Claremont wrote the story. So unless it's been like this great big huge 40-year attempt by Marvel to invoke social justice warrioring, it's just the nature of the story. The other half of this is that Darwin actually tries to end his own life. And the reason why is because he's got no drive, he's got no ambition, no reason to stay going anymore. You know, his dad's out of the picture, his mom hates him, kids at school ridicule him, he's apparently a mutant, doesn't like who he is, he sees no future for himself. The problem is that when he steps off the building to try to kill himself, his body becomes so incredibly light, he floats to the ground like a feather. Yet another instance where Darwin simply cannot be killed. And so because of this, you know, in these last few moments, he's actually met with a guy who arrives and says, look, I know a woman who's basically going around and trying to find mutants that have abilities, or trying to find people with extraordinary skills. She wants to teach you how to use your power. She wants to introduce you to a man that can help you understand your place in the bigger picture. All you have to do is just be willing to accept. And so what this does is it basically leads into the introduction of Darwin as part of the original, or really the second iteration of the X-Men team. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end. If you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video and you guys want to see more videos like it, let me know down in the comments section because I'm kind of curious. I mean, I'd love to cover all the X-Men stuff. The question is, does anybody care enough to watch it? That's the real question. But anyway, guys, we're gonna go ahead and bring this video to an end, and I will catch you all later. Peace.